Greetings, I am the Harpy, and in today's video we are covering the first law series by Joe Abercrombie, yet again. In this video we are going to be covering diction, prose, and style. So in the last video we did kind of diction instances. We talked a little bit about percentages as far as the percent of a particular word used in a chapter to kind of parallel to another chapter. In this one we're going to be talking about the level of language, the control in which certain vocabulary words are used or not used. We're also going to be talking about the way that Joe describes things and the intent by which he describes things. Further than that, we're going to be talking a little bit about rhetoric, persuasive language, and scientific language, and kind of convincing people of things that are true or untrue based off of the way that the information is presented. The first thing that I want to talk about is going to be the register, or the level of which the first law is written. The word choice in it is not particularly difficult or hard to understand. The syntax is pretty straightforward. There aren't overly complicated sentences, and when there are complicated sentences, they are often much more of a character device than they are inherent to the way that Joe is writing. Lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about the fluidity in the way that Joe writes his characters. This is where we're talking about style and getting into some of the character voice that Joe is really known for. We're going to start with colors, actually, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the freebies that Joe has given us. So in one of Joe's interviews, he mentions that Pharaoh doesn't see color, and that's why Pharaoh's chapters don't have any color. Literally, they have no color in them in terms of the way that they are written. This is not true for all characters. Logan predominantly sees color very simply, blue sky, green grass, that kind of stuff. Giselle doesn't mention uh, color as much as he mentions material. So ivory, gold, mahogany, things of that nature. He's much more interested in the specifics of it. This is going to be our diction section. This is going to be talking a little bit about word choice. That is what diction is the choice of words. And when we talk about these different ways of writing observation, it's inherent to each character's point of view, which is also inherent into the way that Joe styles his writing, which is supposed to be very character forward. The observations and cataloging that each character is going to make is going to be different based off of what they value as important. And that comes across in Joe's word choice, in his diction, even down to the colors. In addition to that, when we go into a little bit more of the syntax, a little bit more of the prose, the way that things are described, Logan does a very man of war style analysis of everything. Everything is very violent for Logan. So he looks out across the land and he sees a good place for a battle. Pharaoh looks out across the land and looks for movement. Giselle looks out across the land and sees nothing. These are stylistic things that are brought about because of the diction and because of the syntax, the sentence structure associated. The next little bit that we're in is going to be the prose section, and right now we're talking about syntax or sentence structure. So syntax or sentence structure is going to be the way in which simple sentences and complex sentences are patterned in order to make a larger picture. So the way that we can think about this is, are we using a small paintbrush or a big paintbrush to paint the scene? And for Joe, he is a master of choosing his paintbrushes. He is able to identify when characters require a little bit less detail and require a little bit more detail. In the case of Giselle has these overly complicated, flowy sentences when he's first introduced. They are not overly complicated in terms of the structure, they're overly complicated in terms of how he views the world. Everything is in comparison to him. He needs to have the most fashionable things. Who doesn't like picking on their closest friends and stealing their money? Very characterization style things, but are given to us in the way that Giselle is written, with these more complex sentences compared to Logan Nine Fingers. Logan has these very short, not choppy, but efficient sentences. They get to the point, they reason fairly straightforward, and you trust Logan. You're like, yeah, I'm with you. I think that the next character that would be good to talk about is Glokta. I think that Glokta is a good example of a very patterned kind of character. This is where that style, that diction, that syntax, all of that kind of accumulates. And Glokta is a very patterned character. He's very easy to kind of follow as far as what his pattern is going to be. Glokta is presented with a problem, and Glokta, for the first time that he's presented with a problem, he's smart. He defers to authority. That is his first thing. And then he internalizes what the authority says and then acts with that authority's intention on future measures. So what we can think of this as a really efficient secretary, a secretary who notices that, oh, at noon you get up and get a cup of coffee. So at 11:50 she brings you a cup of coffee. That's kind of how Glokta's character interacts with the world. And it's presented in his syntax and the style in which Glokta is written. He, when we are first introduced to Glokta, he is yelling about the king's taxes. And this is one of those interesting cameo moments where we don't realize that the king's taxes are not Glokta's words. They are somebody else's words, Superior K-Line's. Why? Because he gets yelled at a lot. Glokta gets yelled at a lot because of the king's taxes. So he uses that ahead of schedule. We learn that Glokta reads ahead of the game because he is ahead of the game. And it's one of those subverted kind of psychology things where when you're paying attention to the way that his character is written, it's very structurally reactionary to those in power. He is always trying to appease a higher power, but that higher power is whoever he deigns. That's the dangerous part about Glokta, is that he'll work to the ends of the earth for you, but you don't want to be the person holding the leash. Now we're getting into a little bit more of the style. So style is composed of diction and prose. Prose is the way that things are described. We've talked about the way that things are described as being predominantly based off of what the characters are seeing and the importance of knowing your characters and what they value. The part that we're going to be talking about now is a little bit more of like a totality kind of view. So, the style in which Joe writes is going to be on the end of the spectrum that I'm going to argue is closer to scientific language than it is to literary language. The difference that I'm calling in here is that Joe is very to the point, right? He's an efficient writer. He has his sentences mean something with every sentence that he writes, whether it's just to get the plot further along, whether it's characterization. Each sentence is meant to do something. The opposite end of that spectrum is going to be Brandon Sanderson. Brandon does a lot of world building and a lot of imagery. Not all of that information is useful, but it definitely builds the world. This is going to be the difference, in my opinion, between somebody who's a little bit more of a pantser and somebody who's a little bit more of a planner. So, pantser writers are people who hold on by the seat of their pants and write the vibes, which there's nothing wrong with. And on the other hand, we have the planners, the people who are going in and nitpicking and saying, well, I have a chapter promise here, and I have a little foil promise here, and I have a promise here. This is going to be the end that I think that Joe is on. The part that is additionally different between these two is that Joe employs a very strategic amount of rhetoric or persuasive language, especially with Baez. Baez, when we first read the first law, is playing on our belief systems of a good natured grandfatherly character. We're thinking of him as our elder. We're thinking of him as somebody who's supposed to help guide us through this adventure. And that's not who Baez is. Through no fault of his own, right? Baez is kind of candid about who he is as a person the entire time. We, the readers, just don't want to believe it. He is a liar. He kills people because they disturb his bath. Um, I am convinced that the first time that Logan sees Baez and he's described as a butcher, that the animal was actually the first messenger that they got that day. It, we have a lot of moments where Baez is introduced to us as a bad guy, and we trust that he's not a bad guy because of the use of rhetoric or persuasive language. The part that makes it feel believable is that kind of sterile kind of way of writing in other portions of it. It seems very police report. So and so did this quickly. So and so did that. So and so did this. It's very straightforward to the point, get your points across. But that smattering of persuasive language is really what carries the conversation of trusting Baez throughout the series. Another thing I can bring up since I'm talking about Sanderson and Abercrombie is their use of adverbs. Sanderson has ascribed to the belief system that adverbs are bad and indicative of weak writing. He does everything in his power to avoid them, and it makes for overly verbose and kind of bloated writing, in my opinion. In the case of Joe, he says things happen quickly when they happen quickly. They happen slowly when they happen slowly. And when he wants to avoid using an adverb, he does so, but mostly he uses adverbs as a means of conveying information as efficiently as possible, which again ties back into that kind of scientific language.